Hello everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 11. Today we're going to deep dive into aging. So that's everything to do with aging, the details of physiological effects of aging, the psychological effects of aging, and just how we relate to aging in society. So good deep dive, as I said. We've got two great guests. We've got Andy Lane, who's is Professor Andy Lane, I should say, who's an exercise psychologist. As also a general expert in all things exercise, but he's Associate Dean of Wolverhampton University. And then we've got Greg Whyte, who's also a professor, double professor today. They've been guests on before. So Greg is a big fundraiser for the BBC and Comic Relief. He's done loads of things with those. He's an expert on exercise psychology and performance, former Olympian himself, and sports scientist, obviously. So we get into some big details, also just some really interesting little factoids that I didn't even know about. So hope you enjoy, and over to them. Okay, welcome Andy Lane and Greg Whyte, the professors. Thanks for joining me again. I do really appreciate your time. So we're chatting today about aging, the thing that happens to all of us, whether we like it or not, and a little bit about what it is, and apart from the obvious. And then a bit more detail, a bit of a deep dive into what happens to the brain and to the body. And then also at the end, we're going to talk about what we can actually do to prevent the sudden drop off and decrepitude that often happens. And then what we can do, the easy things, the low hanging fruit, really to stop that in its tracks. That'd be good, wouldn't it? Find a fountain of youth. So how do we define aging to start with anyway, apart from the obvious chronological thing? Is it what starts to happen in the body? Let's go with that first.
But perhaps I'll kick off on this. I mean, for me, effectively what we've got, I mean, it's an interesting one because we talk about it as at both ends of the spectrum. This difference between what we call chronologic age, so in other words, the number of years, versus the biologic age. Anybody who's listening who's got kids, or anybody who can remember back to when they were at school, and you walk out as a year 7 onto the rugby pitch, and there was always that one kid who played tight head prop, who at the age of 11 had
a beard,
chest hair, a beard, and was built like Big Daddy.
Yeah, we had one of those.
The interesting thing about that is actually, there's been much talk around the sort of education sector for a number of years now about, what should we do in terms of sort of school sport? Should we have it so that it is biologically driven, so it's biologic age, so therefore you've got people of equal stature, so in terms of strength, aerobic capacity, mobility, all of those things in terms of fits or globally fitness, and put them all together. And that's because effectively what we see is that maturation process occurs at a different stage for different people. Those with kids will know that some kids mature much younger, so girls get their menses at a much younger age than others, and physical maturation, etc. And interesting enough, as we move through life, that aging process, and I mean, if you look at Andy and I, we're of a similar age. We're both 27.
Feel an insult coming on.
And we look like we've been beaten by the ugly stick on a regular basis. Oh dear. Often what you'll do is you'll compare yourself to others, and you'll meet other people who are the same age as you, who look significantly older, act significantly older, but actually in terms of their functional capacity, appear significantly older. And so therefore what's going on there is that their chronologic age dictating their capacity, their functional capacity, their look, their aesthetic. Actually it's biologic age. And so what you can get is the rate of aging can change, and that rate of aging is associated with a whole host of different things. But if we want to get technical, one of the key drivers to it is this thing called telomere length. Do you want to go that far into it?
You started that, because I've got that on my list of because it's something I've heard a lot about, and if I'm honest, I don't fully understand it. But I know it's at almost a genetic level, isn't it? So it's on the DNA side. So maybe if you can dive into that, that would be helpful.
Well, yeah. Tell you what, we've published a whole host of work in this area, particularly around immune function. So I guess the one thing you have to remember is that a cell, if you remember, effectively the body is made up of cells, and those cells have a lifespan. So they have a functional lifespan for which they deliver a job. Okay.
Yeah.
And so think about this in a workplace scenario. So people come into the job, and they've got a period of time that they're going to be functional in that job.
Yeah.
And then at the end of that job, what you're hoping is that what they have done is that they've trained people to take over their job once they retire.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in a cell sense, what you're talking about there is you're talking about this cell being able to replicate. So effectively, what it can do is take itself and then replicate itself over and over again. So if you take an immune cell, a T lymphocyte, for example, what it does is it knows that at some stage there is turnover. So we're destroying them at a given rate. And so what we've got to do is we've got to produce them at a given rate to keep that stable.
Yeah.
Okay. And so therefore, when the cell is healthy, what it can do is it can replicate itself and produce new cells. Okay.
Yeah.
But in doing that, as part of this DNA on the chromosome, you've got this thing called a telomere at the end of it. It's like the tail of it. Okay. And every time it replicates, that tail gets slightly shorter.
Ah.
Okay.
Okay.
And as that tail gets shorter, eventually it reaches, in honor of the guy that sort of founded and proposed this hypothesis, it reaches what's called the Hayflick limit.
Right.
And at that point, what then happens is that now this cell still functioning, but what it can't do is it can't replicate.
Right. Okay.
And not being able to replicate means that what that cell becomes is this wonderful word called senescent. So the cell becomes senescent. So you've got this cell which is operating, it's working, and to some extent, it's much like as we near retirement, we get to the age where actually we're not sort of producing anything else at the back end of it, and we're just about to retire.
Yeah,
that's the point.
So the cell's kind of checked out.
It's sort of checked out. It's still sort of floating around, still doing a job, but what it can't do, it's not adding to the system. And the interesting thing about that, if we want to, let's talk some sexy language. What it will then do is it will then send through the cell membrane. It will send a signal that it is senescent. And one of the things that we looked at, in T lymphocytes, for example, is we looked at what's called KLRG1, which is a cell surface glycoprotein, which is wonderfully big words, which basically says, look, it pokes something out of the cell membrane to say, I'm senescent.
Right.
And what we can do is we can actually measure the number of senescent cells that we see as they go around. Okay.
I see. Right.
Now the interesting thing about that is that the number of senescent cells, we've got senescent cells all the time throughout life. Okay. But what tends to happen as we get older is that the number of senescent cells gets bigger and bigger and bigger and grows. Okay.
Yeah.
Now that fundamentally is aging.
Right.
But for me, the interesting thing is that what we have the capability to do is we can accelerate that aging.
Right.
So, for example, things that are really potent in accelerating that, things like inflammation.
Right.
And so anything that causes chronic inflammation, and that can range from things like smoking through to excessive sunlight exposure through to obesity, then what that will do is that will accelerate the rate of aging. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, because we can accelerate it, what we can also do by intervention, what we can do is we can slow that rate of aging.
Right.
And so anything that is fundamentally, there are obviously other factors, but anything that's anti-inflammatory. So a great example of that is physical activity.
Yeah.
It's a really potent anti-inflammatory approach. Then what physical activity, exercise, will do is it will actually slow that rate of aging.
Right. Got you.
And that's why through life what we get is we get this difference between chronologic age and biologic age, because it's based upon how we have affected that rate of aging.
Right, gotcha. Well, that's a pretty good sum up of aging. Thank you very much. So
follow that.
We'll just wrap it up there, shall we?
Yeah.
So the weird kind of question I had was, are we designed to live a certain length of time? Because obviously when we can't father any more kids and when we can't produce any more babies, we're kind of redundant anyway in terms of evolutionary. So are we kind of just on the genetic scrap heap then, if you like? Do you know what I mean? Just kind of kicking around. So that was one of the things. Are we designed to actually live this long into our 90s, really, or is it just down to drugs and you know, the fact that we don't have to run away from tigers anymore and you know, stuff like that? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So is
Do you want to take one, Andy?
Go on.
Well, look, your evolutionary arguments would say that once you've reproduced, your role is minimal. Minimal. However, the data on age is quite interesting because yes, average life expectancy is increasing, but that's as much to do with the number of people dying in their youth declining as it is people living longer. When you start looking at the average age of someone who is 60 in around about 1910 or something, that if you get to 60, your chances of getting to 75 are pretty good.
Right.
So those figures haven't shifted as far as the average has.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And it's
So let's
interesting.
just jump in there quick, because this is something I read a while ago about, and maybe you can clear this up then, is that you used to hear these things, oh, you people when they were cavemen used to live to 30 and that was it. That was the average age. But that's kind of a bit of a confusion, isn't it? Because they used to take in child mortality rates. So such high child mortality rates used to skew those numbers so that it was actually nonsense. The average age was always, you know, for adults, if you like, was still in the 60s, 70s and 80s, whatever. But it's just there were so many children dying that it brought the net average down. Is that kind of right?
That, and you think of illnesses and issues that could kill people that we've got, you know, that we can now stop. That so your risk you run the risk of hitting some of those as longer you go on, which no longer are the case.
Yeah.
So childhood is one, and you know Japan is they're long livers, but they don't have many children anymore. They're closing schools by the shed load.
Funny enough, I'm talking about that later, Chan.
Yeah, well, it's kind of you're looking in to see if there's a difference in there, if there's a difference in how people live their lives and so on and so forth. And you start coming back to what it's sort of playing with the numbers here a little bit, but it's not necessarily that people, you know, if evolution has allowed people to live for a great long period of time, and that's prospered. And so if you partly through luck would have been previously, but your ability to not stand on a nail or stand on some metal and get
tetanus.
Well, without a cure without the tetanus but jab, what happens to you?
Yeah, dead.
And so on. Well, exactly.
I tell you what's interesting in of that though is that if you take a look at the data, the sort of current data, what you see is that there's a very strong relationship between socioeconomic status and length of life.
Yeah.
Is if you are poor, you will live a shorter life.
Yeah.
And so you know it comes back to this sort of aging process. Is that there's that rate of aging? You know, if you can't afford high quality nutrition, you know, if your diet is poor, if you can't heat your house, if you don't get the recovery that's required because you don't sleep well because actually there are too many people living in your house and you're hot bedding, etc.
Or you're working 12 hours a day.
You know, and actually stress is exceptionally high because you're much more worried about income and looking after children, etc.
Yeah.
So all of those things can lead to this. I mean, it's an interesting one in the sense that we talk about aging, but actually, what we're talking about is what we call acquired diseases. So those diseases which are acquired associated with lifestyle. So things like coronary atherosclerosis, which leads to heart attack. We're talking about stroke. We're talking about cancer. We talk about diabetes, which then leads to other factors. You know, all of those things. So I think what's interesting is it is multifactorial. I mean, one of the reasons why we have improved length of life compared to cavemen is because of lifestyles. Lifestyle has changed, which is positive, which reduces that rate of age and reduces the prevalence of disease, which then leads to shortening of life. Add on top of that medical care and the role of pharmacology, but just medicine in general. And then actually add on top of that now what we talk about, you know, the role of physical activity promotion, of health promotion, of diet,
Yeah.
stress reduction, of reduction in alcohol. All of those things lead to a reduction in aging, a reduction in the creation of acquired diseases, and so therefore an improved length of life.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I mean, the caveman diet, which might be popular, is not. I wouldn't confuse that with actually having what their diet would be. It's basically eat natural product, and that's actually typically a good thing. But I hear how people take these to extreme.
Yeah, exactly.
You go, well, actually, no, you need a bit of cautious there. What that's really saying is you don't eat processed food because there's no processed food in caveman times. But life was fairly desperate. You slept on the floor, you slept in the outside, you were cold, you had to, and so on. And that's what. And don't remove yourself off from what the reality was.
With the whole paleo thing, for me, the big thing there, the big stumbling block, why I'd kind of call bullshit on most of it, is because they didn't have the foods that we have now. I mean, all these things have been engineered over millennia and decades to look completely different and to provide completely different nutrition than they did back then anyway. So you didn't get a tomato or an apple like you did back then. I mean, there were horrible little crab apple things that used to just be horrendous. So you didn't have the foods that you could eat. You couldn't eat paleo even if you wanted to, is my point.
No.
Because things have changed.
Well,
anyway,
things have changed, and I think also what we have to always remember is that we have this lovely, we put this wonderful gloss over the fact that apparently cavemen, because they were on a paleo diet, they had the most wonderful quality of life. Apparently, they didn't get rickets. Because they were micronutrient deficient,
or riddled with parasites.
They didn't get scurvy or riddled with parasites, or actually get a cold and die from it. From a very simple virus. So I think it's how we reflect on it, really, and that fundamentally is based around the fact that it depends how much money you're going to make out of the sale of your new book. And what you don't want to do is let the facts get in the way of a good story.
No, that's true. And your new paleo recipe book. So if we talk about things more mechanical things now, like things like your joints, bone density, hormone, how hormones drop off for men and women. It's a bit more sudden with women, but with men it's more of a gradual decline, isn't it? Especially talking about sex hormones here, really. And then alongside that, the reduction in muscle mass and strength. So what really triggers that? I mean, if you can look at both sexes, but you see the effect is similar anyway, isn't it? It's a bit more sudden with women on the old osteoporosis front, I think. So what happens there?
Well, so I mean, it's interesting because obviously now in common parlance, something that we would never be allowed to talk about. Three men on a podcast, a couple of decades ago, would never be allowed to talk about menopause.
No.
But now it's very much part of common parlance, and understanding the impact of menopause and the relatively rapid reduction in estrogen and associated hormones, which then require intervention and support, etc. We've got a much better understanding of it, and certainly I wouldn't necessarily say a better understanding. We've certainly got a better conversation. Going over it that everybody is joined into.
It was just taboo, wasn't it? Strange.
Of course, and as many things are, sadly, when we talk about health. I mean, I wrote a book on pregnancy. Well, a man wasn't allowed to talk about pregnancy. I mean, are you crazy? Because a man doesn't get pregnant. And yet now, obviously, the irony being that so many obs and gynae specialists are men. But so it's an interesting one, and I think to some extent. At the same time, what we're not allowed to talk about is what happens to men. And we know that men go through this thing called variably defined and titled, but andropause or somatopause. Where what we see with men is that we see a reduction in growth hormone. Alongside that reduction in growth hormone, we see a reduction in testosterone. And I think to some extent, the interesting thing is that the reduction in male or female sex hormones, the reduction in growth hormone, drive very similar responses in men and women. And that is, classically things that we see, for example. I mean, it's amazing what happens with aging, but, VO2 max, for example. So our aerobic capacity drops, somewhere in the region of about 4 to 5 mils per kg per minute per decade.
Oh, right. Okay.
As we go through. Now, when does that start? Generally, that starts around the sort of mid-30s,
Yeah.
interestingly enough, where we don't think we're old in our mid-30s.
Yeah.
But and this will come on to what we talk about later about, when should we intervene? But it's that mid-30s period where we start to see this gradual reduction. And what we see with things like the menopause, for example. Let me give you a good example, because this is an area that I've created this sports nutrition company around, is something like collagen.
Yeah.
Is that collagen reduces, and collagen is a structural protein, really, really important, particularly for soft tissue, so muscle, tendon, ligament, and articular surfaces. But it reduces generally from sort of the age of the mid-30s, maybe slightly younger in some people, by 1% per year.
Right.
But for a woman that goes through menopause, it reduces by 30%.
Bloody hell.
Almost instantaneously through menopause.
Right.
So I think what we have to be really careful of is confusing the fact that aging only occurs at menopause or andropause. Actually, aging starts much before that. And what andropause and menopause do is that they accelerate that process of aging.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. So it's down to the drop off of the sex hormones that triggers those kind of reactions. So how much bone loss do we
they
have?
accelerate it at that time, but it's ongoing. Sort of general attrition over time. Yeah.
So I've heard some statistics about the amount of bone loss we get per year. You might be able to shed some light on that as well, but it's relevant. It's going to change with each individual person, obviously, but there's quite a lot of bone loss as well, isn't it? As well as muscle mass. Over those early years, the 30s, 40s, and then into 50s. So, I mean, we'll go on to how you can prevent that later on, but it is quite surprising. Quite surprising how much actual calcium leaves the body.
Well, I tell you what's interesting here. Okay, what's really interesting here? Bone is 80% protein.
Yeah.
And what we've got this sort of this dogma that resides around bone, that a bone is all it is calcium. Calcium phosphate, and so therefore that's all that matters. And what we've got to do is replenish calcium. Well, look, I can tell you, having worked in elite sport, and Andy and I worked, for a very long time in elite sport, is that the one thing that we deal with, particularly with female athletes, but actually more latterly, and so we've redefined it. We used to call it the female athlete triad, which is very closely linked. And the reason why Andy and I work in this area is because it's very closely linked physiology and psychology in what generates the female athlete triad. But we reported back in the early 2000s, into late 90s, early 2000s, that we were identifying the same thing in male athletes.
Right.
And now it's been redefined in what we call RED-S, reduced energy deficiency syndrome. So RED-S is sort of the replacement of that. But what we know is that what's interesting is that with people who have very, very high training loads, but calorie restrict, because what they're looking for is to reduce weight, because obviously lighter is faster.
Yeah.
Then what you've got this imbalance between consumption and expenditure in terms of energy. And that has a profound impact. So in women, what it does is it causes a loss of a reduction in estrogen. It can cause a disturbance in the menstrual cycle, and that can move from what's called eumenorrhea, normal menses, into oligomenorrhea, so it becomes sporadic, or they can become amenorrheic. They lose their menses completely.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you get reduction in bone mineral density.
Right.
And that process is called osteopenia.
Oh, right. Okay.
Now the interesting thing is that post-menopausal, this rapid reduction in estrogen can lead to a process called osteoporosis.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the interesting thing for athletes is that if you come into menopause with low bone mineral density, an osteopenic state, then what you do is you exacerbate that post-menopause. And so you become osteoporotic much more rapidly because you're starting at a lower level.
Right, got you. Makes sense.
But the interesting thing is that the same occurs for men. Is that we've reported on a number of male endurance athletes in particular with low BMDs in non-load bearing bones. So generally, what you see in running athletes, for example, BMD in hip and femur tend to be okay, but if you take a look at radial BMD, it's dreadful. It's really low. So it's again an interesting process, which accelerated at those time points of menopause, etc. But our lifestyles can affect it significantly prior to that point, which then has a profound impact on outcome and therefore aging.
And when the athlete's so focused on their weight, and the weight goes down, and they believe that to be good, they're not seeing that actually some of that weight loss as bone in essence.
Yeah.
And therefore, which is long-term derogatory, but it might get a short-term snappy good performance. So that positive reinforcement from trying to do things and to getting better can have really detrimental long-term effects on health.
Right.
And that would occur in your motivated athlete, and it might get on to having falling off the cliff in terms of performance at some point.
Yeah.
And that, we talk about we talk about people trying to keep active late and older, but that deterioration in performance and that social comparison is so important to people. That not being as good as what you were just puts you off.
Yeah,
and therefore you've affected if you're in that position, you've affected your actual structure by reducing your bones, and then you stop doing physical activity, and so you start to gain weight. The extent to which you can rapidly age in terms of everything that goes wrong is colossal.
So is that why often you'll see kind of elite level athletes really falling off the wagon, in terms of really, hate to use the term letting themselves go, but you know what I mean? Sometimes you'll look at someone, 5-10 years after they've stopped competing or whatever, and you think, wow, you've not looked after yourself. So would that be down to the fact that they've just lost motivation to do it?
It's certainly that used to be the response previously, a lot more than it is now.
Yeah,
and particularly with sports like boxers, they used to get enormously overweight.
Yeah.
And there's now more of an awareness of having to keep healthier. But for the higher level sport you go, the more your self-esteem gets wrapped up in your success. You're on the public spotlight for doing that activity, and you suddenly get off that spotlight. There's an encouragement to retire, and if you have retired, your self-esteem, your ego is no longer in the sport. But that doesn't quite sit when you physically feel you really can be in the sport. So getting yourself out of shape is kind of I'm not ready to compete anymore. It was kind of how the boxers would get themselves out of the mindset of being ready to compete. But it's a relatively dangerous path to go along. We'll get into that hopefully a bit more later. But the motivation, having goals and being really excited about those goals and really driven to them is a massive massive strategy to reduce aging across all of these things. And you might be, if you're the best rower in the world and you stop rowing, you've got nothing else to do, but you suddenly find you can run and you're fresh at running. You can suddenly start training the same amount, i.e. James Cracknell, who we all know.
He started doing endurance, super big endurance events, didn't he?
Well, he started. His whole point was, he said, well, my back and my back and leg quads from pushing are knackered from all this rowing, but my legs for running and poundage are fresh as anything. That's what he started off saying in the marathon. And you go, what? That's probably not. And you look at the people who run for years and years, and they've got knee troubles. It's kind of, you get and I've got and we all have lots of friends, etc., who are runners for whom stop running and really struggle to find other sports. And it's that finding another sport that makes you excited is fairly key, as it is, as is keeping your mental alertness up and running. Reaction times does slow down as you get older.
Actually, that's on my list as well. I've got a little question about let's look at mobility first. So why do we lose mobility? What is it within the connective tissue, like your ligaments and your tendons, or is that not the case? Because you see obvious things, like you'll see people becoming more rounded as they get older, but that's more down to the collapse in the spine. I think I'm right. It's just the spine drops, the disc between the spine shrink, and you can lose height by a couple of inches over. Over the last 2 years.
Andy, you're in trouble, son. Andy, is it? Oh, that's not possible. Well, interesting enough, what you're talking about there is sometimes what people call the osteoporotic hunch. And actually, it is a significant reduction in bone mineral density, which can often lead to effectively just postural problems. Now,
Right.
if you then layer on top of that a reduction in muscle mass, which we see with aging, and that leads therefore to a reduction in strength, and so therefore strength endurance is actually that postural problem, which can be skeletally linked. So hard tissue linked is also soft tissue linked. So these things sort of come together. But I think what's generally interesting is that you think about what happens is, so let's talk about muscle function, for example. Muscle strength is lost. Because muscle strength is lost, muscle power is lost. Remember, power is force per unit time. You lose strength, you lose power. Because of those two, and actually linked with mitochondrial size and density, oxidative enzymes, you actually lose muscle endurance.
Yeah.
And alongside that, again, associated with those two things is what then happens is, and interestingly here, that you lose balance and mobility. Yeah. That balance and mobility may actually be linked in part to what's called neurodegeneration. So what's going on in the brain. So we know that we've got neurodegeneration, which is linked to things like a reduction in neurogenesis, the production of new cells within the brain, which then leads to an increased cognitive alterations, which are going on. That'll affect balance and mobility. Therefore, motor performance and control is lost. If we then add on top of that things like flexibility and joint range of motion are also reduced as we get old.
So why are they reduced though? What happens there?
Because for a whole host of reasons, really. I guess to some extent there is an element, and this probably is the key message from what we're talking about today, and that is use it or lose it.
Right. Okay.
Is that as we age, what we tend to do, this wonderful sort of dogma that we have in society is, as you're getting older, just do a little bit less.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
It's like watching a pregnant woman doing exercise and being vilified by the people. So, you shouldn't be exercising when you're pregnant. Yeah. It's exactly the same. You walk into a gym and you see an old person on a bit of kit, and there are other people looking at them going, we shouldn't be doing that. Let's go and help them.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of attitude. Do less. When actually, as we age, the critical thing that we should be doing as we get older is doing more.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Absolutely, driver. So you've got this sort of sociological impact on what people do. They're doing less. They're much less active, and in being much less active, they're obviously losing muscle mass, losing strength, losing joint range of motion. You add on top of that things that are going on that if you don't, as with any training, the bottom line is that we know this, that we've got, with progressive overload, we get adaptation, but as soon as we remove that, you get reversibility. So, I'm sure we're all the same. I have to work at range of motion and flexibility on a continual basis because mine is bloody dreadful. As always has been dreadful, in particularly lower limb, upper body not too bad, but that means you have to train it constantly.
Yeah.
So the idea is that as we get old, we should just keep it. Just for some reason, should just. Well, of course you don't. You either use it or you lose it, and so therefore you've got to keep training that. But then, underpinning that, we come back onto something like collagen. Is that what we're doing? Is we've got this reduction in collagen, which means the integrity of soft tissue around ligaments, around joints, so ligaments and tendons, and within the muscle itself is going to be reduced as well. So as we age, there's lots of things that are conspiring to lead to that reduction in functional capacity.
Right. Okay.
but the key message here around all of these things, VO2 is going through the floor, strength, power, mobility, flexibility, body weight is changed, metabolism is changing. Exercise, physical activity can reverse all of those. It is, without any shadow of doubt, the magic bullet that can reverse all of those aging processes.
I've got a good little anecdote actually, which I'll share with you. Sorry, just a quick one. I've got a friend of mine years ago. His dad used to cycle. He was 92. His dad used to cycle everywhere, and him and his mum were constantly on his case. And you're too old to cycle. You shouldn't be cycling. He'd been doing it for years. He had this old bike. He used to go around town, and eventually he listened to them and gave up cycling. And again, it's only anecdotal, but he wasn't around for much longer after that. A couple of years. And you think, I just wonder that, because he became a lot less active just by the fact that he couldn't anymore, because he was cycling every day, and then he stopped cycling, sat on the sofa, and he didn't seem to move from the sofa. And then a couple of years later, he was gone. And that was stuck in my mind. So I was thinking, basically, you pestered him off the bike. He was perfectly happy, definitely cycling. He was doing a pretty good job of it. And then, I just wonder how much of a part that was.
I'd say it's quite a big part.
Yeah.
I mean, my take on the aging and much of this is that we get better from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and it starts falling off, right?
Yeah.
And it starts falling off at some point because you're absolutely got no choice about it. But for other people, it's because they just haven't done anything.
Yeah.
In some people who keep active in certain sports, they will keep a range of motions, certain types of muscles quite good. But running behind that is that if you're a runner, your cardio stuff will be pretty good. Your up and down, running in straight lines will be pretty good. But there'll be a whole load of stuff that's deteriorating like any other 40, 50-year-old. And at some point, that starts coming into play. Of course, you get less flexible as that. You may get less flexible by the very activity you're doing. When you then try to you put a package in to compensate all of that, it's absolutely enormous.
Yeah.
Because you can't do one thing without having taken care of some part of the others. Of which, as people get older, trying to accommodate all of those if they want to keep the performances of when they were younger becomes almost impossible about the amount of time they've got to do and the system and how systematic they have to be to all of their training to cover all those different bits. Where it then becomes incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to accept there's going to be some that bit in your mind going, well, the aging process has got a whole load of biological factors that are going against me, and you haven't got a choice in that. But you have got a choice in the rate, and you have got a choice in some of the areas. And whatever age you are, if you say, well, if I did this much today, next week I could probably do the same or tiny bit better. You can start keeping a sense of progress. And if you hold on to that type of mindset and then start identifying the different bits whether you want to get stronger or flexible in your hamstrings and your hips and so on, you can push a little bit further. That mindset of not getting to the point, I used to do that when I was younger, I can't do it now. The 90-year-old is an example of what I think is wrong with how we advise the old people. Yeah. We can get to how we are when we're watching old people. It's kind of when you go to an old people's home or an old person's house and they say, I'll make you a cup of tea, and you go, thank you, and then you hear the tea shake. So this is not just me shaking across, because I'm 4 or 3 months older than Greg, shaking across. And what you do is you get up and help them. You go, oh no, you sit down. And what you really should do is let them. That's their physical activities, getting up and putting the kettle on, getting up and turning the jam jar.
No, I'll do that. I'll do that. You sit down.
But you're doing them a disservice by doing that. You're doing that.
I totally agree.
Yourself, not for them.
Yeah.
And they need all those little physical activity opportunities they can get. Otherwise, they sat and did nothing. I think that was me yesterday. But reading about this podcast, it's thoroughly unhealthy. Unhealthy. So the aging process, I think, is so captured in how many years you've sat down doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Rather, so if we can talk about what activity you did, but actually, would better still is how long have you spent sitting down, doing very little? And are the youth who are in their in their 20s now and so on, they will be able to say, well, I spent 10 years on social media by the time they're 50. At the time they've stared at their phones
or playing computer games, sat on the backside for hours on end. It is quite scary, that. So if we stay with that whole kind of loss of, bring it into cognition. So when you what happens in the brain that causes this kind of loss of, I mean, I definitely can feel it now. I mean, I'm 52 next. I can the amount of times I get senior moments now compared to what I used to, walking into a room and going, shit, what was it? What was I wanted? The amount of times that happens now and it didn't used to. So what's going on in the brain that causes this kind of cognitive decline?
Well, I mean, is it a decline, or is it a case of having so much to select through, and is it a case of capacity? Now, when you were younger, you didn't have that many things on your mind. So you said, well, we're going into a meeting, going in to see your family now, so you see your cousins. You're going into family now, you see your cousins. You've got all what the cousins doing, all what the jobs of those are doing. There's loads of things going on. You've got your job running through your mind, and all those other things. It's in some cases we have a struggle to prioritize what we need to be thinking on. And
interesting.
So it's sort of the forgetting of names. Well, I was fine of capturing names when I was a school teacher, because I had to go into school and learn the names of people. But now I bump into people and I go, well, and they'll say, I know you from running. All right. Okay. Well, at least that's narrowed it down, because I've got about 5 or 6 compartments where I see people in. I know where they are, but at this current stage, I need the compartment down. Well, you can say, well, that's not necessarily your memory. That's the complexity of the schemas you've got, and to some degree, the length of time it took to actually prime those. Because if you got into a conversation with a friend at school, you'd go, oh, dear, struggle. Within a very quick period of time, you'd be remembering the times when, when when Tim Voss was caught wall walking, climbing across the top, and all the friend, you'll get back into these situations where you prime your memory, and then your memory will be able to prime it. I think we judge our cold memories on no priming, and it's harsh on ourselves, and we call them senior moments. And we have those because when you're absolutely full of information.
That's it. That's interesting.
The other part is people are quite inactive. So the idea that your brain's deteriorating, well, it might be deteriorating if you're not having to remember anything. And we all now rely on sat navs or phones to drive us everywhere.
Yeah.
And so our short-term memory is shocking. It's pretty much shot to bit because we don't need to use it very much. So we don't need to stop and go, okay, end, turn left, turn right, 400 meters, and try and remember 6 things. We did previously, and we used to do it. And we used to hold in there, and our short-term memory is largely forgotten about. And you look at the work on the Z generation, because I've been doing some more teaching, and I'm just kind of trying to work out who my audience is, who all sit there looking at phones. Well, the Z generation research says this group of people who are young are terrible at memory, have terrible memories, but they have very good ways of accessing the information. They know the route to it brilliantly, so they don't bother remembering anything.
Yeah.
Which explains why they don't take notes. Don't need to take notes. They know the route to it. They know the keywords to find. So that their short-term memories are and so on. It's kind of, so they're not trying to stuff information in their heads. They're getting a blueprint across the computer from how to do it. We are judging in some degrees our ability to memorize things based on trying to remember stuff, when actually it may well be that you may, in 30 years' time, someone comes in, you put your phone up to scan them, the phone will scan them, and it will connect to where you remembered them from and send up their details of you, a bit like a name badges.
Yeah.
And so on.
I tell you what's really interesting in that, Andy, is that all this plays into the same message, really, in a sense, is that actually what we do when we're younger is really, really important. We've spoken about it with bone mineral density leading into menopause. Actually, how you come into menopause is really, really important. We talk about how active we are when we are young. The crucial thing is, look, we know that what's going to happen is we're going to get reduction in bone mineral density post-menopause. So where we start off will dictate where we get to. Well, the same thing is true about muscle mass. We know that we're going to get an inexorable decline in muscle mass. And so therefore, if we come into that period of life with good muscle mass, then it will take longer. Now that decline is the same. But what we can do is one of 2 things. One is we can ensure that we're at a higher level before we start that inexorable decline. And then what we can do is we can intervene at that point to reduce the slope of that decline. So what we can do is, from that perspective, the interesting thing is that as we age, what we do get is we get neurodegeneration. Okay, an increase in the rate of neurodegeneration, because there's a reduction in neurogenesis. And so therefore what we get is we get cognitive alterations. But if you're coming into that period of time where your short-term memory is shot anyway, then all of a sudden you're going to reach that point of which you can't remember anything in the short term much, much quicker. Now, the interesting thing is that what we can do then is therefore at a younger age is be much more proactive about how we're working on that short-term memory, how we teach, the way in which we teach, what we provide students, and how we do that, and actually the way that we function generally in life. But interestingly enough, in terms of that rate of slope reduction, is that what exercise does is actually exercise increases the release of what we call growth factors. So in particular, the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, is increased during exercise. And so therefore what we can do as we start to age is, yes, there's going to be degeneration, but we can slow that rate down. And so therefore two things to think about is, number one, how we come into old age really matters. And then also, once we're in old age, what we do also really matters. And so therefore, for me, the process of aging is lifelong. You know, we start to age at the moment of conception. That's what happens. And that process starts. And so therefore, the idea, we chatted about this earlier, but the idea that do you know what, I'll worry about aging when I take my pension. I'll wait till I'm 65, which, by the time me and Andy retire, it'll be about 105. But I'll wait till that point before I do anything about it. Utterly erroneous. We have to attack the aging process as early as possible through lifestyle in order to improve. And remember, this is not about, and again, we're sort of obsessed with length of life. It's not about length of life. It's about the quality of that life. It's
totally agree.
Rather than years of life, it's life in those years.
Yeah, that's my motto. That's my motto. Yeah, for sure. So is there any, I mean, apart from the obvious benefits of exercise, I always get this visualization of it being almost a good thing to be pushing blood through the body at a high rate. So like improving the circulation, because it might be based on nothing other than a kind of fanciful idea that pushing blood around and getting the circulation to all the corners of the body is a good thing. But I know is there any truth in that? I mean, in terms of things like, I did hear that you're much less likely to get plaque build up in your blood vessels, because if your heart rate is almost pushing through occasionally when you train really hard, you get almost like a jet wash through of the blood vessels. I hope that's true. It sounds a little bit too good to be true. And also getting blood to the brain a bit, the circulation through to the brain a lot better. I think. I mean, is that a nice idea, or is it just an idea?
It's a nice idea, but probably just coined slightly incorrectly.
Okay.
I mean, I think what's really interesting is, like, if you imagine a vessel, so imagine your artery. On the inside of that artery, you've got this what's called an endothelial layer. Okay, it's one cell thick, and the endothelium is really important, because that endothelium is, number one, it's responsible for protecting. If we damage that endothelium, lots of things will damage it, but particularly things like high circulating glucose, smoking, as well as things like trauma, can damage that. And once you damage that endothelial layer, the potential for infiltration into the arterial wall is increased, and so therefore that's where you get atherosclerosis or within the coronary arteries, or actually peripherally around the body. So critically, making sure that we reduce the potentials, those things that could potentially damage that endothelium, really, really important. Right. Now, as well as that, what that endothelium does is it's responsible for the contraction, expansion of the artery. Okay, really, really importantly. And what we do know with aging is that that vascular function, as we call it, is reduced with aging. Now, we've done some lovely studies where we do some brutal things to people, and you can do this thing called flow-mediated dilatation. So what we do is so around the arm, for example, we can actually take a look at how the brachial artery is working by shutting off the blood flow to it. And then what we do is we release blood flow to it instantly. And this is exactly what you're talking about, Lee. And that is that when you get an increase in shear stress, so you get a lot of blood being pushed through it, what it does, it actually stimulates that endothelium and causes potent vasodilation.
Right.
Now, as we age...
Is that occlusion training? Is that the occlusion training?
Well, that's part of the occlusion training, actually. But the occlusion training is actually about ischemic load. Right. So basically about, if you're going to do bicep, what you do is you reduce blood flow to that bicep. The bicep during that exercise become more ischemic, and that then drives the adaptive response of the muscle to a greater degree. So slightly different. but you know what you're saying is really interesting, because really the message is right, and that is, look, if you can get increased blood flow on a regular basis, then that is wholly positive for physiologic function and reduction in disease.
Excellent.
So
I'll take that.
The mechanism is different, but actually what you're saying is absolutely right.
Right. Good. Lovely job. Right. So if we've kind of gone through the basis of aging and the physiological effects, and we've touched on the psychological effects, I don't know whether it's worth just touching quickly on Alzheimer's dementia, which is obviously age. Is it purely age related? I know you can get early onset as well, but what's going on there that's age related? Can you shed any light on that, Andy?
Well, it's a really complex one.
Yeah.
It's probably a podcast in itself, but I mean,
okay, if it is too complicated, we can leave it for now.
No, not really. I think the thing to remember is multifactorial.
Yeah.
There are genetic influences, things like the ApoE gene. So ApoE gene appears to be linked to it. It is age related. It's also associated with things. So you get things called vascular dementia.
Yeah.
So where you've got, as we've just been talking about, actually, where you get damage or disease within the vessels that are feeding the brain blood.
Yeah.
Then that can lead to things like vascular dementia, and so aging has got is associated with it. What we now know, very importantly, is actually that lifestyle has a profound impact.
So we keep coming back to this, don't we? We keep coming back.
Of course.
Yeah, and that's what's fascinating about this is we keep coming back to the same thing. Just exercise and eat better, and it's going to give you a massive age protecting benefit. I mean,
physical activity,
stop smoking,
yes,
yeah,
alcohol reduction, stress reduction, all those things that we always talk about healthy lifestyles.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. It's not just exercise though. It's exercising for half an hour a day and sitting for 23.5 hours a day is also
totally agree.
Very misleading.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Active and a whole of our lifestyles are geared to sitting on the floor, where sitting down, when actually we should, as you get older and you've got more time to do things, it can be very easy just to sit and do nothing.
Yeah.
And so actually having that mindset of I'm still going to do stuff, even if it's a hoovering and so on and so forth, but keeping moving all of the time is quite good. That Greg does that. If you stand up once an hour, you switch on the fat gene. That's right.
Yeah.
Of which that's really important as muscle deteriorates as people getting older. Their risk of staying the same weight but being a bag of being a bit more fat and a bit less muscle as a bit less bone is really worrying, because fitness starts deteriorating. And what you get from that is that cycle, which we haven't really got into, is how people lose motivation to do anything. And they lose motivation to do things partly because their standard of what they achieve deteriorates, or the first time they do something, it feels much harder than what they remember. And a mindset that says I'm now too old, which is prevalent, says, well, actually, I shouldn't do this. And it's then that is really complicated in terms of how people can change it. But partly it is the starting off is saying it's really good for me to be motivating at something. What can I do? And for older people, starting a new sport, bizarrely, I think is good advice.
Yeah.
You haven't got that comparison against your 30, 40, 20 teenage self.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I have runners who say, I want to do under sub 18, and I'm looking at them and going, you're 50 odd. There is no hope of this happening because you're too. Why don't you do a sport? If you're that would be a 90% age-related performance. Why don't you go and? That's unrealistic. You couldn't do that when you were 18 anyway.
Yeah.
Or that age anyway. You've never done. Why do you think you can do it now? Because that's their sport. But if they went and did another sport, then they would find that they'd be much higher up that ranking, they don't have that comparison to go against. So it's finding opportunities to do so. And I think social media is full of them, and picks up people who are starting exercise in their 50s and 60s. Which is quite good, and which is because the plank challenge is going on in social media now, and the squats challenge, and those things are good for people to go along with, and not to think I can only do one, but they can do as many as they want and get. the other part to all of this is have a good social network where someone says, I did a plank for a minute. If your comparison group is a group of ex-athletes, they go, yes. Plank for a minute, yes. And then some 70-year-old says, yeah, I did one for 10 minutes yesterday. And the unheard of comparisons, which ultimately can belittle you in terms of where you're at with your progress. It's finding that goal for you to go for, so that you don't lose motivation, and you get rare glimpses of people who are really motivated, very old, and we often see them as outliers in terms of their oddballs. But actually, all they're doing is pursuing something with intensity, and quite often what they're doing is they might be 80-year-olds doing marathons, but in essence they're walking them.
Yeah.
But that's, if you can walk, why not pursue that as a possibility? If you can ride without falling off, why not pursue that as a possibility? But bike riding is a bit riskier. But it's just it's that encouragement, and it's just challenging that societal almost norm that this is not for you to do. And it kind of, says who is the answer. Says who.
You just brilliantly answered my last question, actually, which was about why do we lose interest in keeping fit as we get older? And that you've answered it pretty much, that it's not necessarily that, it's that you're kind of almost pushed not to do it by society.
Yeah, but we kind of want to keep fit, but we feel that we can't keep fit. We feel like age is going to have this deteriorating effect, and actually you want to drive it down so that if you ran a mile in 12 minutes one week and you had a couple of days rest and then you tried it again, you could probably do 11:50.
Yeah.
And therefore you can progress.
Yeah.
And if you had a bit more rest, you could probably do 11:48. And after 6 weeks of conditioned training where you go, I've got a few sore hips, so you do some exercises for them counter movements which are deteriorating, you're suddenly down to 10:30.
Yeah.
And you get that sense of progress. And
I think it's never too late for that.
We do.
Never
I
too
think
late
also, what we should never, what's really important though is that society is changing. And I think that expectation piece is changing, and what you go down to a gym. I was at the gym this morning. You go to the gym now; it's actually a really nice space for any age where you can go in there. If I think about the days that when I was an elite athlete, I used to go down the gym and it was full of meatheads. And as a 70-year-old woman, you would never go to the gym. Are you crazy? It's not a place for you.
Yeah.
Whereas now, actually, I think that sociologically we've changed our attitudes and the provision of facilities to make it much more accessible. Number one. And I think for me, what Andy's talking to as well is this idea of making it social, is to actually make it fun, make it enjoyable. And I think what we see now at the gym, and within the sort of fitness and leisure sector, is that group, class activity. An awful lot of older people go to that class because it is part of their social circle.
100%.
They happen to be doing, whatever it is that they're doing when they're there. They're very active, but they're there for a chat and a coffee afterwards. Brilliant. So it's actually about making it part of lifestyle and remembering that it is never too late to change lifestyle, and any change in lifestyle will have a positive effect without any shadow of a doubt.
Yeah. Brilliant. We'll wind it up in a second. So we're just getting towards the hour now, which is great. But I just wanted to touch on one other couple of things. Just about if people have listened to this and they haven't taken away that we advocate exercise, strength training, mobilization, then they haven't been listening really. So we don't need to go over that again. But there's one question that I've had, and it's never really been fully answered. It's that why there's such a high level of people 100 plus in Japan, in Okinawa, and you hear about these stories about certain locations around the world where they just seem to have an absurdly high level of people very, very fit and able into their 90s and 100s. Is it purely down to you hear things like fresh vegetables, certain about variety of fresh vegetables and foods and fish, and is it as simple as that, or is there something more going on there?
Well, see, I did some research onto this question prior to coming to this, and when you look into Japanese research into Japanese populations, there is a big contrast between those who are active and those who are inactive.
Okay.
So what you've got is the effect of being active for what seemingly the effect of people being active for much longer and eating a healthier diet. In other words, this preventative approach being shown at the top end of age.
Right. Okay.
And for those who have not done it, you don't seem to get any difference.
Right.
So, I mean, there's partly disentangle the stats. Japan have got a very low birth rate. But then getting into the details of the older age and then comparing Japanese samples with themselves, it's that the healthier ones, as in those following being more proactively healthy, are living longer.
Right.
And having a better quality of life along with it. Because that is the cliff effect, isn't it? Typically with exercise, you have high quality of life and it drops off at the end, as opposed to a gradual slope of your quality of life deteriorating as you get older to the point where you've got no quality of life and then you die. Exercises are good quality of life and suddenly die, or that's quite one of the trends anyway.
Yeah, I want to die. I want to die on the bench press at 94.
Like it. That's 94 years old, isn't it?
Yeah, 94 kilos. I'll take it.
Not 94 kilos.
Yeah. I think, but that was the important point that Andy makes about that what we call the period of morbidity. You know, as we get older, there will be a period where we die, and we'll die for various different reasons. But what we want is that period of morbidity to be as short as possible. Yeah. And also as late as possible. What we don't want to do is spend 15 years dying. Yeah, 100%. Because we are all going to die. That's the nature of it. I think the interesting thing about stats and comparative stats between nations about length of life is that one of the things that we never like to talk about, but that is about socioeconomic status. Yeah. Look, if you live if you are deprived, and interestingly, within population, so you take a look at the UK and you look at the length of life, predicted length of life from low socioeconomic status up to the rich, it's a direct linear relationship. But the same is true of nations. Compare Central Africa with the UK, it looks like we're doing a great job. Compare us against a very affluent population. But then layered on top of that is the sociology of it, is actually, what's the rate in this country? Type 2 diabetes rising by 500 new cases a day. It's terrifying. We've got some of the fattest people in the world in this country when it comes to obesity prevalence. Yeah. We've got some of the most inactive individuals per population compared to 11 million people doing less than 30 minutes of activity in a week. All of those things. If you then take a look at what the Japanese are doing, where actually culturally it's an amazing place. Every time I've been there, is that you see the parks full of people being physically active very late into life, and so alcohol consumption, smoking prevalence, all again, and stress and all those things about healthy lifestyle. What you've got to be very careful about is saying, because they're Japanese. Actually, it's not. It's about all of those things which are modifiable. There are lifestyle modifiable factors that you can adopt that will reduce that rate of aging, that will compress that period of morbidity towards the end of life, and therefore improve not only length but also quality of life. Yeah. Right. Well, that's a lovely way to wrap it up. Cheers. Thank you, gentlemen. That was always it's always a great chat with you guys. So appreciate your time again. But the one, just to say, the one thing I took out of that though, which I am a bit worried about, is the fact that you said that Andy is going to get even shorter. That to me, don't, mate. He's already falling off the screen. It's already dropping off the screen. Look at him. See, he's getting shorter as we speak. Brilliant, fellas. Thanks very much. I'm just going to stop the recording, but please don't shoot anywhere. I just want to say goodbye to you afterwards. Yeah. Thank you for that. It was excellent. Absolute pleasure. Yes. Brilliant. Pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode of Mature Muscle, please subscribe and find us on most social media. Until next time, stay shredded.